George Taylor married the newly widowed mother, assumed ownership of the entire company for 10 years until his stepson became of age. George then passed the ownership back to the rightful heir of the estate. Now that is a definition and an example of integrity.
George Taylor.
George Taylor.
George Taylor.
George Taylor was born in 1716 in Ireland to a clergyman. Not finding the life that he was seeking in Ireland, George decided that he would immigrate to America about the age of 20 years old. Unfortunately, George had no money that he needed to pay for the expenses of the trip. Well, a man named Mr. Savage, who owned a very large ironworks company, Warwick Furnace and Coventry Forge, paid for George's trip under the condition that George would be hired to throw coal into the furnace at his factories. After realizing George's intelligence, Mr. Savage moved him into the counting room as a clerk, where he was much happier and much more useful. 6 years after George's arrival in Philadelphia, Mr. Savage died, leaving behind a widow and a small family. Soon after his death, George married the widowed mother and assumed ownership of the entire company for a while. 10 years later, when his stepson became of age, George then passed the ownership back to the rightful heir of the estate. In that decade, however, George had built a fortune for himself and a large mansion in Northampton, which became his permanent home. Without a furnace or a forge of his own, George went out and found the Durham Ironworks, which was available for lease at the time. George jumped at the chance to set up his own business, and he continued in his profession. George Taylor was elected to the Provincial Assembly for Pennsylvania in 1764 and was re-elected for the next 5 years. During his time in this role, he was a member of the committee to draft the instructions of Pennsylvania Delegates to the First Continental Congress, a member of the Committee of Correspondence and of the Committee of Safety. In 1774, George was able to join his two jobs when he became the first supplier of munitions to the Continental Army. Just 2 years later, in 1776, George elevated his political career to the federal level when he joined the Continental Congress. And luckily, he was just in time to sign the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, at the age of about 60. He served Congress through 1777. He was then elected to the new Supreme Council of his state. But he served there for only 6 weeks, apparently due to illness. There was no record of any public service afterwards. He died in 1781 at the age of 65. Charles Augustus Goodrich writes of George Taylor, "The happiness of these colonies has been our first wish, their reconciliation with Great Britain our next. Ardently we have prayed for the accomplishment of both, but if we must renounce one or the other, we humbly trust in the mercies of the Supreme Governor of the universe, that we shall not stand condemned before his throne." Integrity is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, the state of being whole and undivided. He just wanted the best for every situation and every person. Integrity is doing what is right just because it's right. The end.